After discussing determinants of consumption, we're going to turn to determinants of other components of aggregate expenditure. So, namely investment, government spending, and net exports. For each one of them, we're going to talk about the determinants of each one of them and then link it to the aggregate demand. So let's start with investment. So here are a couple of determinants of investment. Obviously, the list can be much longer than what we have here, but we are going to focus on these two in our class. The first one is real interest rate. In fact, for our purpose, interest rate will suffice. Okay, so how does interest rate affect investment? So suppose we have a lower interest rate or we have a decrease in interest rate. What do you think is likely to happen to investment? Do you think firms are willing and able to spend more on big budget items such as building a factory or buying half a dozen of new machines or upgrading all the computers? So what do you think? One way to think about it is that a lot of these firms, when they buy these big budget items, when they make these investment spending, they are likely to finance the spending by borrowing from banks or financial markets. So in return, they will have to pay interest rate. So when interest rate is lower, what is likely to happen is firms are more encouraged, for firms have more incentive to make this spending because it becomes less costly to finance all these big budget items. So holding everything else constant, normally when interest rate is lower, we are likely to see an increase in investment. Okay. Then we are simplifying things in a classroom setting. In our classroom setting, we deal with one change at a time. But sometimes, actually most of the time in real life, we don't deal with one change at a time. We deal with simultaneous changes. So that can create some problems. That can create some difficulty in analysis. So let's look back at early 2000s. Early 2000s, in the 1990s, late 1990s, we had a technological breakthrough where for the first time we have very widespread use of internet and high-speed computers. Okay? So that was a technological breakthrough that brought about a very huge economic boom. But after that, in early 2000, we started to have a slowdown, a recession. Okay, so in the early 2000s, we had a very sluggish growth after emerging from the recession. So what the central bank of the United States, which is also called the Federal Reserve, what the Federal Reserve did was that it lowered the interest rate. It lowered the interest rate 12 times in a row to a 42-year historic low. Obviously, what we have today is much lower than what we had in the early 2000s, but at that time, that was very low. That was 42-year historic low. So the Federal Reserve kept lowering the interest rate 12 times in a row. The reason why the Federal Reserve had to lower the interest rate so many times in a row was that it did not see the intended effect in the beginning. Okay, so when it lowered the interest rate, investment did not pick up. So many people argue that, well, maybe, economic theories are not are not right, because we're supposed to see a pickup in interest rate with a lower we're pickup in investment with a lower interest rate, but we did not see that. In fact, when you look closely, there was nothing wrong with what economic theory has claimed. At that time, not only that interest rates were lower, but we also had another determinant, another force at work. Okay? So there was another factor that affected investment. That is the expectations. But now we're not talking about consumers' households' expectation. We're talking about firms' expectations. Companies, when they plan investment, when they plan production, they do it ahead, right? So if they expect the future economy to be gloomy, they are unlikely to spend on big budget items. They are unlikely to build a new factory. They are unlikely to move to a new office. They are unlikely to upgrade our computers. Okay? So firms' expectations about future economic conditions plays a very important role in firms' willingness and ability to make investment. So that's what happened in the early 2000s. In the early 2000s, because people got carried away in the late 1990s. They over invested, and then when the recession hit, a lot of firms found themselves in overcapacity. So too much capacity, too many factories being built, too many new computers, too many machines to rarely use, and so on and so forth. So all of a sudden, all these firms, they went from overly optimistic to overly pessimistic in the early 2000s. So they were not going to do anything despite the lower interest rate. Okay? So that was that dominating force at that time. Okay? So we had at least two factors that could affect investment at work at that time. Okay? But lucky for us in a classroom setting, almost all the time we deal with one change at a time. Okay? So here, so if expectations of firms about future economy, okay, is good, or you can say upbeat, right? Upbeat, okay, or optimistic. We are likely to see a decline in investment. So in contrast, if firms are pessimistic about the future of the economy, they are unlikely to make, they are unlikely to make as much investment. Okay? So let's turn to the graph. So here's an example. So assuming that firms are very optimistic about the future of the economy, they think the economy in the near future is going to be robust, it's going to be good. So they are very likely to increase investment. Okay? So what we have here is an upward shift of the aggregate expenditure. Oh, by the way, let's take a step back. Previously, we dealt with consumption function. But now, because we have two components of the aggregate expenditure, consumption and investment, so we are no longer dealing with consumption, but instead we deal with the sum of consumption function and investment function. So together, they are called the aggregate expenditure function. Okay? So we usually use the shorthand AE. So as you can see initially, we have this initial aggregate expenditure, which is a sum of consumption and investment. So as the investment pick up because firms are very optimistic about the future, we now have an upward shift of the aggregate expenditure function, but you please note that consumption function stays the same, but investment now has increased. So we have a larger investment. Accordingly, because investment is a component of aggregate demand, so we're going to see an increase in aggregate demand. Okay, so that's a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. So let me just write down in words. Okay. So let's change the layout. Okay, so firms are optimistic about the economy in the near future. So they are likely to increase investment, increases. And because investment is a component of aggregate demand, they are likely to increase the aggregate demand. Okay, so that will wrap up our short exercise. So let's turn to another component of aggregate demand, government spending or government purchases. For government purchases, we are not really going to go into the detail of the determinants of government purchases. We're not really going to dig into the factors that will affect government spending. Because as many of you are aware, government spending is not really driven by economic decisions or economic interests. So whether the government wants to build a public infrastructure such as a highway or build a public school or spend more on defense, this is not necessarily driven by only economic interests. A lot of times it is also driven by political interests or ideological reasons or sociological reasons. So because of that, it can get quite complicated. So we're not going to go there. We're going to just take it as given. So we're going to take government's purchases as given. So if we are told that the government increases its defense spending, then we're going to take it as given. We're not going to ask, what makes the government make such decision. Another thing that we want to make note of is transfer payments and income taxes. Okay, income taxes. So, although transfer payments and income taxes can affect aggregate demand, as we have learned previously, they affect aggregate demand through consumption. They are not part of government purchases. If you can recall what we learned in the beginning of the semester when we calculated GDP using expenditure approach. Transfer payments and income taxes, they can affect aggregate demand, but there are no goods and services changing hand there. So they are not part of government spending. Okay? So here's an example. So now we are dealing with three components of aggregate expenditure. So the aggregate expenditure now is the sum of consumption, investment, and government spending. So suppose we are told that government decides to lower its spending on public infrastructure for the next fiscal year, then we want to know how that will affect the aggregate demand. So obviously this is going to lower the aggregate expenditure. Okay, so we now have a lower government spending. Okay, so we go from G0 and to G1 is a lower government spending in this case. So we have downward shift of the aggregate expenditure function. Accordingly, because government spending is a component of aggregate demand, we're going to have a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve. So that's a decrease in aggregate demand. So here we go. We have an example. So government spending decreases. Government decides to lower its spending on public infrastructure. Next fiscal year. So that means government spending is going to decrease. So we are likely to see a decrease in aggregate demand. Okay. All right. The last determinant we are going to talk about is net exports. Okay. Last components of aggregate expenditure that we're going to talk about is net exports. We're going to discuss factors that will affect net exports. In other words, we're going to discuss determinants of net exports. Once again, the list can be much longer than what we have here, but we are just going to just focus on two. The first is relative income, and the second one is exchange rate. So, relative income. So, it is relative income. What that means is the income of a country or an economy relative to the other economy. So let's look at an example. So suppose the United States and the UK, two major trading partners. So let's say in the recent years, the US, the income of American people have been rising at a much faster rate than the people in the UK. So in other words, Americans have become relatively richer than the British. So when you look at the transaction across the border, what is likely to happen? What is likely to happen to the imports of the United States? Most likely, Americans are likely to buy more from other countries, including the UK. So imports is likely to increases. Yeah, I'm sorry, let me just write it here. Relative income increases. So imports increases. So if you recall net exports, which is exports minus imports, with an increase in imports, we're likely to have a decrease in net exports. So that is what is likely to happen when the relative income of an economy increases, okay, compared to its neighboring countries or major trading partners. It is likely to see a decrease in net exports. And next, we're going to look at exchange rate. Exchange rate is basically the price of one currency in terms of the other currencies. So how many US dollar is exchanged for how many yen? So how many one US dollar is worth in terms of China yuan? How many US dollar can be exchanged for 1 euro? So next we are going to look at an examples. How a change in exchange rate can affect the net exports of an economy. So let's consider two countries, two economies, or two major trading partners, the United States and Japan. So two trading partners. assume that the initial exchange rate is 1 US dollar exchanged for 100 yen. And let's make some assumptions. Let's assume that these two countries produce almost the same mix of goods and services of comparable qualities. And let's assume that there are no trade restrictions between these two countries. That means Americans can buy freely from Japan and vice versa. Let's also assume that there is no home bias. That means Americans do not particularly favor American goods and services, and Japanese does not particularly favor Japanese goods and services. So those are the assumptions that we make. And then now, here's a sweater that is made in United States, okay? And it is priced at 100 US dollar. So if a Japanese wants to buy this sweater, how much does he have does he have to come up with? So I'm sure many of you are familiar with how this works. So if we want to buy a foreign good, what we're going to have to do is to convert our own national currency into a foreign currency. So this is what a Japanese has to do. So how much does a Japanese have to pay for a US made sweater? So a Japanese has to pay, okay? So I'm sure many of you have already gotten the answers. So that's 100 yen, right? 100 yen that he has to come up with. So that's 100 US dollar converted back into yen. That is 10,000 yen. So now let's say the US dollar depreciates. Depreciate means the currency loses value in terms of other currency. So it weakens. So what that means is now 1 US dollar now is worth less in terms of Japanese yen, let's say 80 yen. So what we have here is now the same sweater that is made in the United States will cost more for a Japanese, cost less for a Japanese. So 8,000 yen. So do a little bit of a calculation here. So $100 converted into yen, that will be 8,000. So for an American, obviously the sweater costs the same. The sweater will still cost $100 for an American. But for Japanese, now it is cheaper. The same sweater now is cheaper. So this is what is going to happen if a currency depreciates. If a currency depreciates, which is the case that what we have observed, Americans are going to be able to sell more to Japanese because Japanese now will find the goods cheaper. Okay? So exports of the United States goes up. At the same time, obviously you can switch the scenario a little bit to a Japanese-made sweater, okay, and do the calculation again. Then you find out that with a depreciation of US dollar, Japanese goods becomes more expensive in the eyes of Americans. So that means Americans are unlikely to buy as much from Japan. So imports of the United States goes down. So with an increase in exports and a decrease in imports, the net is going to go up. In contrast, if we have a currency appreciation, appreciation means that the currency gains value. $1 now is worth more in terms of Japanese yen. So if that happens, Japanese is likely to find American goods more expensive. So that means they're not going to buy as much from the United States. So exports of the United States comes down. At the same time, when the US dollars strengthened, Americans are likely to find foreign goods cheaper. So Americans are likely to buy more from other countries. So we're likely to see an increase in imports. So the net exports is likely to come down. Okay? So this is what usually happens. So here is an example. So suppose we have an appreciation of US dollar. Okay, so suppose we have an example, appreciations of US dollar. So US dollar, okay, so US dollar strengthens. We are likely to, or appreciates. What we are going to see is a decrease in exports. At the same time, imports increases. Americans are going to buy more from other countries, and then we are going to see a lower exports, net exports. So graphically, you are going to see a downward shift of the aggregate expenditure. So please note that this time, aggregate expenditure is now the sum of all four components. Okay. But now we have a smaller net export, so we have a downward shift of the aggregate expenditure, a decrease in aggregate expenditure. Net exports is a component of aggregate demand, so that means we're going to see a decrease in aggregate demand. Okay, so it is illustrated by a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve. Okay, so that is going to give us a decrease in aggregate demand.